Howdy there, folks. My name is Matt Baker, and we started a new campaign of Dungeons & Dragons this last weekend. And this right here is the first campaign log for that new campaign. And contained within, we are going to dive into a recap of what happened and also talk about what I learned as a DM, and I'll be able to share my own perspective on the events and what I think could have gone better, what I think went well, all of that kind of stuff. I do have some notes off to my right, so if you ever see me glancing that direction, I am just checking my notes. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. Our story begins in the Edoreskian Archipelago, in the narrow strait between Louter Long and Old Vrootvar. We find upon these waters the Aurum's Whim, a schooner of some renown. The morning light crests over the waves and leaves a crimson glow. Morganus, the first mate of the Aurum's Whim, paces nervously on the top deck. The crew was already tense, but this ill omen of red light leaves nerves on a razor's edge. Vega, the navigator, senses the tension and charts a course to the village of Ivir. A clear map can bring peace of mind. Meanwhile, Clark, the ship's clerk and cook, is working away, toiling in the galley to prepare a meal that will hopefully also ease some of this tension. And Zara, the quartermaster of our vessel, plays her viol up on the deck, bringing calm tunes and pleasant songs to our noble crew. Titian, the ship doctor, keeps a careful eye, but he is admittedly not helping with the tension as his bird, Cardinal, tends to just not say the right thing at the right moment and, well, in this case, can only say bad news. And last but not least, Captain Talia Lafria looks over the note that she had been given just a few days prior. Captain and crew of the Aurum's Whim, subjects of the Empire, by order of Empress Luminous Antiletta, you are hereby summoned to the village of Ivir, townstead in the land of New Azagrat, on the 47th day of spring in the 451st year of the age known as Rebirth. You are to take audience with Knight Commander Theron of the Imperial Wardens, Lord of the Bastion's Watch, in the Inn of the Welting Wall at the hour when the sun meets the sea. You are to share word of this meeting with no one. Failing to hold these words within your tongue shall be considered treason of the highest. A summons from the Empress was no small ask, no small favor, and certainly the greatest recognition that this little boat had ever seen. What the Empress wanted was beyond any member of the crew. They had no idea. And as Talia finished looking over the summons, she began her rounds to check in with each officer and crewman of the Aurum's Whim. One by one, Talia met with her crew, and as she met with Titian, Aggie, the ship's lookout, dropped down from the crow's nest, grim look in her eyes. "Captain, there's a ship approaching us. A brig, by the looks of it. She flies no flags." Talia looked at Aggie. She looked at the rest of her crew and nodded. She responded, "Use the signal glass, send greetings." Aggie does so. She moves to the glass. The signal is sent. "No response, Captain. They're closing in on us." Talia looked back. "Give them warning to keep their distance." Talia ordered the crew to load the guns, to prepare for battle. This time, as Aggie sent signal, there was a response. Not in the form of a return of the glass, but in the raising of flags. The first, black, with a white lantern with a skull replacing the candle in the glass. The second, another black flag, a red gemstone with crossed cutlasses behind it. Pirate flags. Below deck, Clark worked away, cleaning the dishes from the earlier meal. He glanced over out the portal at the ship that was approaching. He didn't need flags to recognize it. He didn't need anything, really, to recognize it. He knew that ship. He had lived aboard it. That is the Ruby. That is his wife's ship. And she was coming for him. Above, Talia knew pirates when she saw them. She would not be fired upon first. The Aurum's Whim released several shots, but the rival vessel, the Ruby as it is known, is bigger, has more guns, has larger sails. This was a losing battle. From the pursuit cannons of the Ruby came chained hooks that launched and jabbed into the side of the Aurum's Whim. The Ruby closed to board as they yanked upon the Aurum's Whim, dragging her closer. As the ships came closer and closer together, everybody drew swords. The moment before battle had come, and the captain of the Ruby stepped forward. She was a tiefling woman, with ruby-red skin, her left hand replaced with a mechanical claw. The same is true of her right leg. One of her horns snapped off and broken. This is Captain Katarina Black. As she stepped forward, she looked out over the crew. I have no quarrel with you, or your ship. Bring out my husband, and bloodshed can be avoided. Talia stepped up. If you have a quarrel with one of our crew, you have a quarrel with our whole ship. Meanwhile, below deck, Clark began hiding in a barrel. Katarina retorted to Talia. I don't want this to get out of hand. I don't want to have to kill all of you. Do you hear that, darling? You come out, and all your friends can live. Talia shouted back and down. You don't have to do it, Clark. Katarina. She knew her husband. They had been together a long time, after all. She made the killing blow. Clark, darling, love, sweetie. I challenge you to a duel. Formally. Whatever happens, if you come up here and fight, I let your ship go. As long as you show your face, your friends can live. As long as you fight me, your friends can live. That was it. Clark had no choice. It was a matter of honor. It was a matter of his friends. And he could never refuse his true love. His only love. His greatest love, Katarina Black. And Clark climbed those stairs. Arriving on the deck of the Aurum's Whim, still wearing his apron from the galley, Katarina placed down a plank, and he was allowed to cross to the Ruby. The crew parted ways, and he entered the lion's den. Katarina stepped down, demanded her dueling pistols brought forth. She looked out at Clark. Are you going to use mine or one of your own? Clark tried to entreat her to see reason, tried to bring her away from this brink, tried to avoid this duel, but there were no words. After all, he had put their kids at risk. He had betrayed them. He had betrayed pirates, certainly. He was proud of it, proud of what he had done, but to Katarina and the crew of the Ruby, Clark was nothing more than a traitor. Clark agreed that he would use Katarina's guns. The box was opened, brought forth by her first mate. Katarina took hers, and then Clark stepped forward. He reached down and took out the gun, and stepped away. Vega, on the Aurum's Whim, observing from across, noticed something, and shouted out, Why doesn't Clark get a second? You said this is a duel. If it's a proper duel, he gets a second. Katarina shrugged. Sure, Clark can have a second. That's fine. She had her first mate. Morganus stepped forth, first mate of the Aurum's Whim, and crossed over to the Ruby. Morganus asked Clark if there was anything he wanted to do in negotiations. All Clark could say was that everybody stays out of it, that everybody watches his back. Morganus agreed and stepped out, meeting with the first mate of the Ruby. They exchanged words. They exchanged the decrees. It was clear nobody would be involved. This was a fight between Katerina and Clark. They stood across from one another. It was time. The duel had come. Each having a gun in their hand. Another pause, as Clark had Titian and inspect the gun, inspect the pistol, make sure there was no foul play afoot. The gun was clean. Katerina wanted a fair fight. Clark took the gun, and they stared across from one another. Katerina asked, "Are you ready, darling?" All Clark could say was, "No." And then it hit. The moment. The time to draw. Clark. He loved her. He loved Katerina. He loved his children. And he hesitated. We don't know if he would have shot at Katerina. We don't know if he would have pointed his gun at the sky. We don't know if he would have kept it towards the ground, thrown it to it. But Katerina, she didn't hesitate. Her pistol whipped up in a flash, and 2 shots rang out, ripping through Clark's body. He dropped to a pile, to a pool of his own blood. Katerina advanced. And all Clark could whisper out as he fell, as unconsciousness took him, "You always were faster." Katerina took another step. "Well, that's that then. I'll keep to my word. You all are free, of course." And at this moment, Morganus stepped up. "Would you allow us to give Clark a burial?" Katerina shrugged. "I've always believed that family should take care of burials, but so be it. But to do a burial you need a corpse." She fires 2 more shots into Clark's unconscious body. The entire crew of the Aurum's Whim winces as they cut through him. Morganus goes to gather Clark. Talia stares out at Katerina. Another shot from Katerina. Clark is dead. Morganus picks him up and begins crossing the plank to the other ship, back to the Aurum's Whim. And that was that. The duel was over. Katerina leaned against the railing of her vessel and stared down Talia. Talia looked back. "You have made an enemy today. The next time we meet will not be so kind." Katerina shrugged. Morganus was crossing the plank. She glanced over, realizing that these people were going to be a threat later. Katerina looked back at Talia and just said 3 words. "Sink the fuckers." And the cannons fired. Crew and crew faced off against one another. The Aurum's Whim firing back. The Ruby firing back. Katerina took several shots throughout the battle as they ripped away from one another, the chains breaking off. The Ruby pursued the Aurum's Whim, firing mortar and shot, ripping through it, and the Aurum's Whim took heavy damage. But, thanks to some clever sailing, they managed to push ahead. Morganus had been pulled over, and laying on the deck of the Aurum's Whim was Clark's corpse. But luckily no more had died, and eventually they pulled away, escaping the Ruby. And that is where we ended our first session, with the Aurum's Whim limping away, heavily damaged, and the ship clerk dead. And so with all that in mind, What did I actually learn from this session? And I'm not going to go too in detail because this was the first session. I don't think there was a... Well, actually, I'm not sure. I don't think there were a huge number of takeaways. A couple of the big ones were that the rules I had written for ship combat worked reasonably well. There are some tweaks to be made, and players need to be assigned what they're going to be doing a little bit more during ship-to-ship combat. We utilized Tailspire for our battle maps when we were doing ship-to-ship combat. I learned some lessons there about how to make things load a little better because we use custom minis. But those were two really big takeaways. I also learned that conspiring with your players is a good idea. So, if any of my players are watching, this will be news to you. But me and Clark, or in this case, the player's name is Dylan, had worked together. Clark is not Dylan's actual character. Clark is a burner character meant to help set up the campaign. Dylan's real character is Theseus, the Cyclops. So, we had this fun, dramatic moment that allows us to introduce Katerina to the crew and build tension and stakes, and even have a dramatic death really early on that sets the tone of the campaign without really having to ruin a player's day. So I think that is a big lesson. Conspire with your players. Work with them. See what they would be interested in conspiring with you on. Beyond that, I think this particular conspiracy could have worked a little better had I let Clark be played for 2 or 3 sessions. I think that would have built more investment in the character, made people care about him a little more before he, got killed and kicked the bucket. I think that would have been helpful and made it a little more dramatic because the other players, their characters were invested in Clark, but the players weren't super invested. So I think that is a lesson. But then again, I did want Dylan to be able to jump into Theseus right away. So, give and take there. But those were some of the key takeaways. I am looking forward to next session. We are going to continue their journey towards Ivir. They've had this little bit of an interruption, but it wasn't so much that it has made it where they won't be able to show up to their appointment on time, which that would be bad if they did not make their appointment on time. Disrespecting a summons from the Empress is unwise in this setting. So, with that, I think those are the key takeaways, and I hope you like the story of what happened, and I look forward to sharing the next campaign log with you. See you around.